Good evening, dear friend, and welcome back to this quiet corner where history whispers its most extraordinary secrets. Tonight, we're settling in together for a remarkable journey into one of World War II's most fascinating and least-known stories. The tale of an army that never fired a shot in anger, yet helped win the war. Whether you're winding down after a long day, seeking comfort in the gentle company of history, or perhaps you're a veteran yourself finding solace in stories of service and ingenuity, you're warmly welcome here. If these longer historical journeys bring you peace, please consider subscribing. There are many more untold stories waiting to be shared in these quiet evening hours. Tonight's story is different from our usual tales of battle and sacrifice. Instead, we'll explore the extraordinary world of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known to history as the Ghost Army. 1,000 men whose weapons were imagination, artistry, and the ancient art of deception. These were soldiers who fought with paintbrushes and sound effects, who wielded rubber tanks and phantom radio signals, who saved thousands of lives through the power of illusion. Picture, if you will, a unit where fashion designers served alongside fine artists, where sound engineers worked next to sculptors, where the tools of war included inflatable tanks that could be erected in minutes and loudspeakers that could mimic the sounds of entire armored divisions. This was an army of magicians in olive drab, conjuring entire military formations out of thin air. So, pour yourself something warm perhaps, and settle back as we journey together into a world where art met warfare, where creativity became a weapon, and where a small band of American soldiers proved that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the paintbrush, truly is mightier than the sword. Our story begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the classrooms and studios of American art schools, where young men with talent and imagination had no idea they would soon be called upon to help deceive the Nazi war machine. Chapter 1. The Art of War, Conception and Recruitment, 1943-1944. In the autumn of 1943, as leaves turned golden across American college campuses, a curious notice appeared on bulletin boards at art schools from New York to Philadelphia. The message was deliberately vague, almost cryptic. Artists wanted for special army assignment, camouflage work. Bernie Bluestein, a 19-year-old art student at the Cleveland Institute of Art, spotted one such notice in March 1943. Like many young men of his generation, Bernie knew he would soon be drafted. The war was consuming young Americans at an alarming rate, and student deferments were becoming harder to maintain. But this notice offered something different. A chance to serve his country while using the artistic skills he'd spent years developing. All for serving his country, but not exactly the fighter-type person, Bluestein enlisted in the enigmatic unit. He didn't know it at the time, but the assignment would prove riskier than most non-combat roles. If the Nazis found out that members of the so-called Ghost Army were playing them for fools, they were likely to retaliate brutally. But in 1943, the 19-year-old artist saw only an opportunity to serve while pursuing his passion for art. The man behind these recruitment efforts was Colonel Billy Harris, a career military officer with an unconventional vision. Working alongside Major Ralph Ingersoll, a journalist turned military planner, Harris understood that the coming invasion of Europe would require more than traditional military might. It would need guile, creativity, and the kind of innovative thinking that seemed to flourish most naturally in artists' studios and creative workshops. Ingersoll often referred to the 23rd as "my con artists," and claimed the unit's creation was his sole original contribution to the war effort during World War II. It was an apt description, though it hardly captured the deadly seriousness of their mission. The inspiration for this unusual unit came from across the Atlantic, where British forces had been perfecting the art of military deception since the early days of the war. The Ghost Army was inspired by the British units who had honed their technique during Operation Bertram, a 1942 deception Egyptian operation in which the Allies deceived German General Erwin Rommel about the timing and location of the Allied attack. In the desert campaigns of North Africa, British deception specialists had learned to create phantom armies using dummy tanks, false radio traffic, and carefully orchestrated misinformation. Their success at the Battle of El Alamein in late 1942 had proven that deception could be as powerful as any artillery barrage, as decisive as any tank charge. But the American unit would be different, more mobile, more technologically sophisticated, and drawing on a uniquely American resource, the country's vast pool of creative talent. In art schools across the nation, young men who had planned careers as painters, sculptors, designers, and photographers suddenly found themselves being recruited for the most unusual military unit in American history. The recruitment process was selective and somewhat mysterious. The unit consisted of a carefully selected group of artists, engineers, professional soldiers, and draftees, including famed artists such as fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane. Many would not learn the full scope of their mission until they arrived at their training base. Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters, was a young art student when he encountered the recruitment notice. Kelly entered into the war efforts of World War II in 1943. He requested to join the 603rd Engineers Camouflage Battalion, which filled its ranks with artists and was known as the Ghost Army. For Kelly, as for many of his fellow recruits, it was his time with the battalion, painting and producing camouflage, that stands in as his basic art training. Bill Blass, who would later become a household name in American fashion, was already making waves in New York's fashion circles when he voluntarily joined the military. Born in 1922 in Indiana, Blass was beginning to make a name for himself in New York fashion circles in the 40s when he voluntarily joined the military. Even during his wartime service, Blass maintained his eye for style and design. Blass sketched his corporate logo during his wartime service, lying on a bunk in Luxembourg in 1944. It would be another 25 years before he had his name on the company door. Art Kane, who would become famous for his innovative photography, particularly his iconic jazz portraits, brought different skills to the unit. These men represented the diverse artistic community of 1940s America, painters and designers, photographers and sculptors, all united by their creativity and their willingness to serve their country in an unconventional way. Activated on January 20th, 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Ghost Army, was the first mobile, multimedia, tactical deception unit in US Army history. Consisting of an authorized strength of 82 officers and 1,023 men under the command of Army veteran Colonel Harry L. Reeder, this unique and top-secret unit was capable of simulating 2 whole divisions, approximately 30,000 men, and used visual, sonic, and radio deception to fool German forces during World War II's final year. The unit structure reflected its multifaceted mission. 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, composed of 379 men, and therefore the largest of the units in the 23rd HQ Special Troops. The battalion took care of visual illusions. These included weapons, trucks, and fake tanks, all for the purpose of deceiving the enemy that was observing from afar. Camouflage capabilities were fundamental, the reason why some artists were part of the Ghost Army. Signal Company Special, composed of 296 men, this company performed radio deception. They would imitate the modus operandi of real radio operators to confuse the enemy. These men would become masters of what the military called spoof radio, transmitting fake messages that would convince German intelligence that large American units were operating where none existed. 3132. Signal Service Company, composed of 145 men, the unit would deceive through the use of sound effects from speakers. They were the youngest unit in the Ghost Army. Under the leadership of Hilton Howell Rayleigh, a New Orleans native who first worked as a wartime correspondent, an investigative reporter, and also as the man responsible for recruiting Amelia Earhart to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, this unit would perfect the art of sonic deception. Finally, 406th Engineer Combat Company, composed of 168 men under the orders of Captain George Rebb. This company was dedicated to the protection and security of the other units of the Ghost Army. While the other units created illusions, the 406th provided the very real security necessary to protect the illusionists. Many West Point graduates and former Army Specialized Training Program participants were assigned to the 23rd, and it was said to have one of the highest IQs in the Army, with an average of 119. This was not just an army of artists, but an army of intellectuals, men chosen as much for their intelligence and creativity as for their artistic ability. The training phase began at Camp Forest, Tennessee, where these diverse talents were molded into a cohesive unit. The unit had its barracks at Camp Forest, Tennessee, and was fully formed at Camp Pine, New York, now Fort Drum, before sailing for the United Kingdom in early May 1944. The training was unlike anything in the American military's experience. Part art class, part theater workshop, part technical school. Men learned to inflate rubber tanks using portable air compressors, to rig sound systems that could project the noise of armored divisions for miles, and to create radio traffic so convincing that it fooled even friendly forces. They studied the organizational structure of American divisions, learning to mimic not just their equipment, but their communications patterns, their habits, their quirks. Formed at Camp Forest, Tennessee in 1943, later joined by the Sonic Deception Unit that had been stationed at Pine Camp, today Fort Drum, New York, the 23rd began creating test dummies and having them photographed from the air and from different angles on the ground to see if they were realistic enough to fool sharp-eyed German photo interpreters. The rubber tanks that would become the unit's signature tool were marvels of engineering and artistry. The visual deception arm of the Ghost Army was the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. It was equipped with inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, trucks, and airplanes that the men would inflate with air compressors and then camouflage imperfectly so that enemy aerial reconnaissance could see them. The imperfect camouflage was crucial, too perfect, and German photo interpreters might become suspicious, too obvious, and the deception would fail. The artists of the 603rd had to master the subtle art of making their fake equipment look convincingly real, complete with the kind of minor mistakes and careless details that characterize genuine military installations. They could create dummy airfields, troop bivouacs, complete with fake laundry hanging on clotheslines, motor pools, artillery batteries, and tank formations in a few hours. These installations had to pass the scrutiny of German reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead, operated by experienced pilots, and observed by skilled photo interpreters looking for any sign of Allied military activity. As spring 1944 arrived and the great invasion of Europe drew near, the men of the Ghost Army prepared to put their unusual skills to the ultimate test. They had trained for months in the art of deception, but now they would face an enemy that had been fighting for nearly 5 years, that had experienced every form of Allied trickery and subterfuge. 50 caliber machine guns, the 23rd took part in 22 large-scale deceptions in Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine River, the bulk of the unit arriving in England in May 1944, shortly before D-Day. On May 2nd, 1944, with the Normandy invasion just a few weeks away, the 23rd packed up and sailed to England, where British deception artists had long been at work under the aegis of Operation Fortitude. The young artists who had answered those mysterious bulletin board notices were about to participate in the greatest deception in military history. As their transport ships sailed toward Britain in early May 1944, these 1,000 men carried with them not just the hopes of their commanders, but the hopes of the entire Allied cause. They understood, even if they couldn't yet fully grasp the scope of it, that they were about to attempt something unprecedented, to deceive one of history's most professional and experienced military forces through pure artistry and imagination. In England, they would join forces with British deception specialists who had been laying the groundwork for the greatest hoax in military history. Together, they would convince the German High Command that the Allied invasion of Europe would come not at Normandy, but 150 miles away at the Pas de Calais. They would create phantom armies, stage massive fake preparations, and sell a lie so convincing that Adolf Hitler himself would believe it. The Ghost Army was about to go to war, not with bullets and bombs, but with rubber tanks and radio signals, with sound effects and stagecraft. They would fight the most important battle of their lives using weapons no army had ever carried before. Imagination, creativity, and the ancient art of making believe. Chapter 2, Operation Fortitude. The Greatest Deception. May-June 1944. The English countryside in May 1944 bustled with preparations for the greatest military operation in history. But amidst the genuine preparations for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, an elaborate theatrical production was taking shape, one designed to fool the most powerful military force in Europe. In Britain, they were based near Stratford-upon-Avon, and troops participated in Operation Fortitude, the British-designed and led D-Day deceptions of a landing force designated for the Pas de Calais. The irony was not lost on the more literary-minded members of the Ghost Army. They were staging their greatest performance near the birthplace of Shakespeare, the master of illusion and dramatic deception. Operation Fortitude was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Operation Fortitude was a military deception operation by the Allied nations as part of Operation Bodyguard, an overall deception strategy during the build-up to the 1944 Normandy landings. Fortitude was divided into two subplans, north and south, and had the aim of misleading the German High Command as to the location of the invasion. The logic behind Fortitude was both simple and sophisticated. Looking at a map of Europe, one can see that the shortest distance across the English Channel is from southeast England to the Pas de Calais in France. This geographical reality worked in the Allies' favour. It was exactly where German military logic suggested the invasion would come. Fortitude's job was to reinforce this logical assumption, while the real invasion force prepared to strike at Normandy, 100 miles to the west. A variety of deceptive methods were employed to ensure Fortitude South achieved its goals. S Army Group, FUSAG. This army was supposedly stationed in southeast England under the command of none other than famed US General George S. Patton. The choice of Patton was inspired. Patton was a smart choice by the Allies. He was the general most feared and respected by the German High Command, and therefore the one most likely to be put in charge of an invasion force. If Patton was in southeast England preparing to invade Calais, German reasoning went, then that must be where the real invasion would come. But FUSAG existed only on paper and in the imaginations of its creators. FUSAG consisted of 11 non-existent divisions, 150,000 imaginary men, and it would be encamped on the fields of Kent and Essex in southeast England. Creating the illusion of such a massive force would require every trick in the Ghost Army's repertoire. Large numbers of dummy tanks and vehicles were deployed in groups all over southeast England to simulate an army preparing to move. At the same time, a huge volume of fake radio traffic was transmitted and received by fixed and mobile units across southeast England. The rubber tanks that the 603rd Camouflage engineers had perfected during their training now took centre stage. A soldier stands with a dummy M4, which was a mainstay of the Ghost Army visual deceptions. The unit had literally hundreds of these. These inflatable Shermans were marvels of both engineering and artistry, capable of fooling German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at thousands of feet. Among other things, Operation Fortitude involved the creation of a sham army in order to fool any German reconnaissance planes that happened to fly over the Channel. In Folkestone Harbour, the Allies built 255 dummy landing craft. They were made by lashing steel tubes to buoyant steel drums and covering them with canvas. The attention to detail was extraordinary. They also built fake army encampments throughout southwest England. These camps included tanks, trucks and jeeps that were realistic when seen from above, but were actually made out of rubber. Soldiers were even given rolling equipment to make tire marks behind the tanks. Every element had to be perfect, because German photo interpreters were among the best in the world. They had years of experience analysing Allied installations, and they knew exactly what to look for. The tire tracks behind the tanks, the positioning of equipment, even the patterns of wear around field kitchens, all had to look authentic from the air. To aid in the ruse, fake military buildings were created whilst inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft were deployed across locations in the southeast. To further cement the ruse, Patton was photographed touring these fake FUSAG camps. These photographs would find their way to German intelligence through carefully managed channels, providing proof of FUSAG's existence. But visual deception was only one element of the elaborate hoax. The radio specialists of the signal company Special worked tirelessly to create the communications signature of a massive army group. For weeks on end in the spring of 1944, British and Canadian units worked in the tunnels around the clock, sending a host of coded fake radio messages all over Britain to simulate the communications of FUSAG, as if preparing for an invasion. It was all encoded, so the signallers had no idea what they were sending. However, they knew it was important because of the requirement to work around the clock in relentless 8-hour shifts, 7 days a week. These men became unwitting actors in the greatest deception in military history, transmitting messages for divisions that existed only in the imagination. The sonic deception specialists added another layer of realism to the performance. Though most of their major operations would come later in the campaign, during Fortitude they began perfecting techniques for projecting the sounds of military activity across great distances. Tank engines, construction equipment, marching troops, all could be simulated with remarkable fidelity using their sophisticated sound systems. The British contribution to Fortitude was equally sophisticated, involving double agents who had been turned by British intelligence. Double agents delivered false information to reinforce this deceit both before and after the Normandy landings. The most famous of these agents, Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbo, invented a network of imaginary agents who were supposedly supplying him with information on Allied preparations. Garcia's network of fictional spies provided German intelligence with a steady stream of false information about Allied preparations. His reports confirmed what the Germans wanted to believe, that the main invasion force was gathering in southeast England under Patton's command, preparing to strike at Calais. Even the Allied bombing campaign supported the deception. In the build-up, the D-Day, Allied bombing also played a key role in fooling the enemy. Whilst bombing under the Transportation Plan campaign looked to cut off Normandy from being effectively supplied by German reinforcements, areas around the Calais region were also targeted to convince the enemy that was the true target for the invasion. For every bomb dropped on transportation targets in Normandy, others fell around Calais, maintaining the illusion that both areas were equally important to Allied plans. The bombing pattern itself became part of the deception, telling a full story through high explosives. As D-Day approached, the tension among the Ghost Army personnel was palpable. They understood the magnitude of what they were attempting, and they knew that the lives of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers depended on their success. The inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic weren't just props in an elaborate game. They were weapons of war, as important as any gun or bomb. Some troops went to Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day, where they simulated a Mulberry Harbour at night with lights intended to draw German artillery from the real ones. Even after the invasion began, the deception continued, with Ghost Army units creating false targets to protect the vital artificial harbours that were keeping the invasion force supplied. The success of Operation Fortitude can be measured in a single, stunning statistic. The startling success of Bodyguard, and especially of Fortitude South, is reflected in German belief in the existence of FUSAG as late as August 1944, 2 months after the D-Day landings. As a result, the Germans kept vital units away from the main fighting front in Normandy, because they were still expecting a second, larger invasion in the Calais area. Hitler was so convinced of the existence of this ghost army that he refused to send reinforcements to the Normandy area for 7 weeks. The Allies had hoped their decoy plans might buy them 2 weeks. 7 was unthinkable. The Phantom Army had achieved something that no real army could have. It had kept an entire German army group paralysed and useless for nearly 2 months. On the night of June 5-6, 1944, as Allied paratroopers began dropping into Normandy and landing craft approached the beaches, the men of the Ghost Army could take quiet satisfaction in their contribution to the greatest military operation in history. Their rubber tanks and radio signals, their careful attention to tire tracks and laundry lines, had helped make possible the liberation of Europe. As D-Day kicked off, the deceptions were far from over. Allied aircraft dropped aluminium foil, known as window, attempting to fool German radar that a large force was heading for the Calais area. Small boats and aircraft headed in the same direction to further sell the idea. Even as real bullets flew and real men died on the beaches of Normandy, the war of deception continued. German commanders, still convinced that Normandy was a feint and Calais the real target, held back reserves that could have turned the tide of battle. The Ghost Army's greatest victory was invisible. The battles that were not fought, the reinforcements that never came, the German strength that was never brought to bear. But Fortitude was only the beginning. As Allied forces established their foothold in Normandy and began the long campaign across France, the Ghost Army would be called upon for even more audacious deceptions. They had proven that imagination could be as powerful as ammunition, that creativity could be as decisive as courage. The artists and engineers, the sound technicians and radio operators who had answered those mysterious recruitment notices at American art schools were no longer students or civilians. They had become warriors in the most unusual sense, fighting a war where victory was measured not in ground taken or enemies killed, but in enemies fooled, in attention misdirected, in the successful sale of carefully crafted lies. Their education in the art of war was just beginning. The beaches of Normandy were only the first stage in what would become a months-long campaign of deception across the battlefields of Western Europe, a campaign that would test their creativity, their courage, and their commitment to their unusual mission. Chapter 3. The Artists Go to War. Normandy to Brittany, June-September 1944. The English Channel was rough on the morning of June 20th, 1944, as the first elements of the Ghost Army crossed toward the Normandy beachhead. Some troops went to Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day, where they simulated a Mulberry Harbour at night with lights intended to draw German artillery from the real ones. The men crowded onto the transport ships carried with them not rifles and ammunition, but inflatable tanks and sound equipment, painting supplies and carefully forged unit patches. 14 days after the initial landings, the Normandy beaches still bore the scars of the Great Assault. Twisted metal and abandoned equipment littered the sand, while in the distance the sounds of artillery reminded everyone that this was still very much a war zone. But for the Ghost Army, this devastated landscape would become their first theatre of operations. Their initial mission was both crucial and dangerous: to protect the mulberry harbours that were keeping the invasion force supplied. These artificial harbours, one of the engineering marvels of the war, were vital to Allied success in Normandy. Without them, the massive quantities of supplies needed to sustain the invasion would have to come across open beaches, a far more vulnerable arrangement. Some troops went to Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day, where they simulated a fake mulberry harbour at night, with lights which attempted to draw German artillery from the real ones. Working under cover of darkness, Ghost Army specialists set up elaborate light displays that mimicked the activity patterns of the real harbours. From German observation posts miles away, it appeared as though there were multiple harbour installations along the Norman coast. The deception was particularly dangerous because it required the Ghost Army men to position themselves between the German artillery and the real targets they were trying to protect. If the deception worked too well, they would find themselves under intense bombardment. If it failed, the real harbours would be destroyed, potentially crippling the entire invasion effort. For many Ghost Army soldiers, this was their first taste of actual combat conditions. We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolour, recalled John Jarvie, Corporal, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Even under fire, the artistic spirit that had brought these men into the unit continued to flourish. The artists of the Ghost Army were prolific. They used any spare moments to work in sketchbooks and on drawings and paintings that give us a window into their extraordinary lives. Their sketches from this period show a unique perspective on war, not the heroic poses of propaganda posters, but the quiet moments between battles, the everyday reality of soldiers living in a landscape of destruction. Ellsworth Kelly, the future master of abstract art, found himself painting watercolours of Norman villages in between missions to maintain the fake harbour lights. His time with the battalion, painting and producing camouflage, stands in as his basic art training. Years later, Kelly would credit his wartime experience with teaching him about colour, form, and the power of visual perception, lessons that would inform his entire artistic career. Bill Blass, meanwhile, was discovering that his eye for fashion and design translated surprisingly well to military camouflage and deception. Bill Sales, an art director and military veteran, recalled Blass's can-do attitude. He would never shirk a duty. Even in the muddy foxholes of Normandy, Blass maintained the sense of style that would later make him famous. My father told us very entertaining stories of his time in the war, which contrasted sharply with what some of my friends' dads had been through. His stories focused on how they would inflate the tanks at night, or how they would impersonate other army divisions, or how Bill Blass re-sewed his uniform so it fit better. The attention to detail that made Blass a great designer served him well in the military, where even the fit of a uniform could contribute to the overall illusion. The unit's next major operation came in late July and August 1944, during the siege of Brest. After this, the entire unit assisted in tying up the German defenders of Brest by simulating a larger force than was actually encircling them. The port city of Brest, on the western tip of Brittany, was heavily fortified and defended by a determined German garrison. Taking it would require a significant commitment of Allied forces. The Ghost Army engaged in its first large-scale deceptions in the summer of 1944 as it deployed 50 dummy tanks and positioned sound trucks within a few hundred yards of the front line during the siege of the French port of Brest. This operation would test every skill the unit had developed during their training in England and their initial missions in Normandy. The strategic situation at Brest was typical of the challenges facing Allied commanders throughout the summer of 1944. German forces had been ordered to hold the Atlantic ports at all costs, denying them to the Allies and complicating the supply situation. The longer these ports remained in German hands, the more strain was placed on the artificial harbours and the cross-channel supply lines. But Allied forces were needed elsewhere. The pursuit of German armies across France toward the Seine River and Paris required every available division. The solution was to use the Ghost Army to make the forces actually besieging Brest appear much larger than they really were, convincing the German defenders that any attempt to break out would be hopeless. As part of Operation Brittany, the Ghost Army deceived the Germans about the location of General George Patton's Third Army, which eluded the enemy and raced eastward across France. While Phantom forces appeared to maintain the siege of Brest, Patton's real tanks were free to pursue the retreating Germans toward the heart of France. The deception at Brest showcased the full range of Ghost Army capabilities. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers deployed dozens of inflatable tanks in positions where German observers could spot them from the city's defenses. From a distance, it appeared as though massive tank formations were gathering for an assault on the fortress city. The sonic deception specialists positioned their sound trucks close to the front lines, projecting the noises of tank movements, artillery preparation, and troop concentrations. Until a division arrived to plug the gap, the illusionists held the precarious line for 7 days with their inflatables and loudspeakers that played the sounds of rumbling tanks, shouting troops, and even sergeants barking out orders for soldiers to put out their cigarettes. These sound effects were remarkably sophisticated. The 3122nd Signal Service Company had spent months recording actual military activities, then editing and mixing these recordings to create convincing audio landscapes. They could simulate not just the mechanical sounds of military equipment, but the human sounds that accompanied military operations. The shouts of officers, the conversations of soldiers, even the mundane sounds of camp life that would convince enemy listeners that thousands of men were present. The radio specialists added their own layer of deception to the Brest operation. They transmitted the communication patterns of multiple divisions, creating the electronic signature of a massive force. German radio intercept stations, listening carefully to Allied communications, would hear exactly what they expected to hear from a major siege operation. Rick Beyer, co-author of The Ghost Army of World War II and producer and director of a 2013 documentary about the outfit, said the Ghost Army found Patton to be among the easiest generals they worked with. Patton was extremely helpful and welcoming and made suggestions to make the deception better. He totally embraced their ideas, he says. This cooperation was crucial to the success of the deception. Unlike some generals who were skeptical of unconventional tactics, Patton immediately grasped the potential of the Ghost Army's methods. He understood that every German division that remained pinned down at Brest was one less division that could oppose his advance toward Germany. The artists found themselves working in conditions that would have challenged the most dedicated plein-air painters. They inflated dummy tanks in fields still pocked with shell craters, positioned sound equipment while under intermittent artillery fire, and maintained radio schedules while living in hastily dug foxholes. During quiet moments between operations, many continued their artistic work. The sketchbooks and watercolors from this period provide a unique record of war, seen through an artist's eye. Unlike the photographers who documented the war for newspapers and magazines, these artist soldiers captured intimate moments, personal perspectives, and the aesthetic details that others might miss. Arthur Singer, who would later become famous for his wildlife illustrations and create one of the most best-selling special-issue postage stamp series, Birds and Flowers of the 50 States, spent his spare time sketching the birds that continued to nest in the Norman hedgerows despite the chaos of war around them. Even in the midst of deception operations, his naturalist's eye remained sharp. The success at Brest established patterns that would define Ghost Army operations for the remainder of the war. They had proven that small numbers of men with the right equipment and training could successfully impersonate much larger forces, freeing real combat units for operations elsewhere. But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated their ability to operate close to actual combat zones. We were going to fake out the Germans, while the true divisions pulled out of the line and moved north or south of the position to attack. We would hold that position with just a few men. It was dangerous work because we didn't have the firepower to withstand a frontal attack, recalled George Dramis, who served with the Signal Company Special Radio Team. This was the essential paradox of Ghost Army operations. To be convincing, They had to position themselves where real units would be positioned, which meant they were often more exposed to enemy action than the combat units they were impersonating. Their only protection was the success of their own deception. The men learned to live with this constant tension between illusion and reality. During the day, they might be painting realistic-looking tire tracks behind inflatable tanks. At night, they might find themselves under actual artillery bombardment as German forces attempted to strike what they believed to be major Allied installations. The 406th Engineer Combat Company, the Ghost Army's security element, took on increasing importance as operations moved closer to active combat zones. These men provided the real firepower that protected the illusionists, but their numbers were limited and their weapons relatively light. The unit's primary defense remained its ability to pack up and move quickly when the deception was complete. By September 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the rapid advance across France, the Ghost Army had evolved from an experimental unit into a proven combat organization. They had participated in operations that saved countless lives and contributed measurably to Allied success in the Normandy campaign. But their greatest challenges still lay ahead. As Allied armies approached the German border, they would face an enemy that was desperate, well supplied from nearby industrial centers, and fighting for the survival of the Reich itself. The deceptions that had worked against German forces defending French ports would need to be even more sophisticated and convincing when employed against troops defending the fatherland. The artists who had answered those recruitment notices at American art schools were no longer students or novices. They had become skilled practitioners of military deception, capable of creating convincing illusions under the most difficult conditions. They had learned to work as a team, combining their individual artistic talents into collective performances that could fool experienced enemy commanders. As autumn 1944 approached and Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany, the Ghost Army prepared for operations that would test every skill they had learned and every innovation they could devise. The war was entering its final phase, but the need for deception had never been greater. Chapter 4. Masters of Illusion. The Battle of the Bulge and Beyond, September 1944, March 1945. The autumn of 1944 brought a false sense that the war in Europe might soon be over. Allied armies had swept across France in a matter of weeks. Paris had been liberated, and German forces seemed to be in full retreat toward their homeland. But appearances, as the men of the Ghost Army knew better than most, could be deceiving. As the Allied armies moved east, so did the 23rd, and it eventually was based within Luxembourg, from where it engaged in deceptions of crossings of the Ruhr River, positions along the Maginot Line, Hürtgen Forest, and finally a major crossing of the Rhine to draw German troops away from the actual sites. Luxembourg in late 1944 was a study in contrasts. The tiny nation had been liberated, but it remained within range of German artillery. Allied supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches, and the rapid advance had left many units dangerously low on fuel, ammunition, and other supplies. It was here, in the rolling hills and dense forests of the Ardennes, that the Ghost Army would face one of its most challenging missions. When a yawning gap opened in Patton's line during his attack of the fortified French city of Metz in September 1944, the Ghost Army again aided the general. Until a division arrived to plug the gap, the illusionists held the precarious line for 7 days with their inflatables and loudspeakers that played the sounds of rumbling tanks, shouting troops, and even sergeants barking out orders for soldiers to put out their cigarettes. This operation required every bit of skill and courage the Ghost Army had developed. They were not just creating the illusion of military presence, they were actually holding a section of the front line with nothing but rubber tanks and sound effects. If German forces had chosen to probe their positions, the deception would have been revealed with potentially catastrophic consequences. The sophistication of their audio deceptions had reached remarkable levels by this point. The men of the unit, during their years of service, learned to improve the techniques and to develop technologies. For example, they learnt how to record, mix, and modify sound records to obtain all the different sound scenarios necessary. The sound trucks could now project realistic audio environments over distances of several miles. German listening posts would hear the distinctive sounds of tank engines idling, of tracked vehicles moving through forests, of artillery pieces being positioned and prepared for firing. The audio was so convincing that it sometimes fooled Allied forces as well. But the Ghost Army's greatest test came in December 1944, when German forces launched their last major offensive of the war. The Battle of the Bulge caught Allied commanders by surprise, creating a dangerous salient in American lines and threatening to split the Allied armies in two. The Ghost Army's radio deception also drew the Germans away from Patton's relief of the Belgian town of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. As the 101st Airborne Division held the crucial crossroads town against overwhelming odds, Ghost Army radio specialists created false communication patterns that suggested major American reinforcements were gathering in areas far from where Patton's Third Army was actually preparing its relief attack. This radio deception was particularly sophisticated and dangerous. The signal company special had to create the electronic signature of entire divisions moving to positions where no Allied forces actually existed. German radio intercept stations, working frantically to track American troop movements during the confused fighting of the Bulge, had to be convinced that major American units were heading in directions that would draw German reserves away from Bastogne. The men operating these radio deceptions were working under tremendous pressure. They knew that if their false signals were detected as fake, it could compromise other Allied operations. But if they were too subtle, German intelligence might not take the bait. Finding the right balance required both technical skill and an almost intuitive understanding of how their enemy thought. George Dramis, who took part in the radio deceptions, later recalled the tension of these operations. The idea was that we're going to create a little unit of about 1,000 men or so, and we're going to try to pretend we're a much larger unit. We were going to fake out the Germans, while the true divisions pulled out of the line and moved north or south of the position to attack. We would hold that position with just a few men. The visual deception specialists faced their own challenges during the winter operations. The snow that blanketed the Ardennes made their rubber tanks and inflatable equipment more visible from the air, but it also provided opportunities for new forms of camouflage and concealment. They learned to use snow and ice to their advantage, creating installations that looked convincing from German observation posts across the frozen landscape. Bill Blass, ever the perfectionist, found that his attention to detail served the unit well during these winter operations. He ensured that the fake installations had the right kind of wear patterns in the snow, that the camouflage looked appropriately weathered, and that even small details like laundry lines and field kitchens appeared authentic from a distance. The Christmas of 1944 was spent in the field, with Ghost Army units scattered across Luxembourg and eastern France. For many of the men, this was their second Christmas away from home, and the war that had seemed nearly won in September now appeared likely to continue well into 1945. But their contributions to the Allied war effort had never been more important. Every German division that was misdirected by their deceptions was one less division available to strengthen the Bulge offensive or defend against Allied counterattacks. Their invisible war of illusion was helping to save the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the Ghost Army prepared for what everyone hoped would be the final campaigns of the war. The crossing of the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural barrier, would require careful coordination and maximum deception to achieve the element of surprise. The Ghost Army pulled off its most elaborate hoax in March 1945 as part of Operation Viersen. As the Ninth Army prepared to make the dangerous crossing of the Rhine River, the Ghost Army positioned itself 10 miles south of the intended landing spot to redirect German attention. Ninth Army would cross the Rhine River 10 miles south of its actual crossing point. Operation Viersen represented the culmination of everything the Ghost Army had learned during nearly a year of combat operations. The Ghost Army inflated both 600 dummies and their own size by impersonating 2 divisions and 40,000 troops. To give the impression that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were amassing, radio chatter spread false reports about their intended movements, and sonic trucks blasted a soundtrack of pontoon bridge construction, artillery fire, and even officers swearing. The attention to detail in Operation Viersen was extraordinary. The men inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles, transmitted false radio dispatches, and blared simulated sounds of soldiers building pontoon boats, enabling the 9th to enter Germany with little resistance. They created not just the visual appearance of a major military build-up, but the complete sensory environment of a river crossing operation. The sound effects for this operation were particularly sophisticated. The sonic specialists had to create convincing audio of pontoon bridge construction, something that required careful study of actual engineering operations. They recorded real bridge building activities, then modified and enhanced these recordings to create the impression of massive construction projects along the Rhine. Meanwhile, the radio specialists transmitted detailed communications between imaginary engineering units, discussing water levels, bridge capacities, and construction schedules. German intelligence, intercepting these signals, would have heard exactly what they expected to hear from a major river crossing operation. The success of Operation Viersen exceeded even the Ghost Army's own expectations. German forces committed significant reserves to defending the false crossing site, leaving the actual crossing point lightly defended. The Ninth Army's assault across the Rhine met minimal resistance, establishing a bridgehead that would soon expand into a major invasion of Germany itself. The visual deception for Operation Viersen required careful attention to the kinds of equipment and installations that would actually be present for a river crossing. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers deployed not just tanks and trucks, but pontoon boats, bridging equipment, and engineering vehicles. From German observation posts across the Rhine, it had to look like a complete amphibious assault force was gathering. Even the timing of the deception required careful choreography. The fake build-up had to develop at a realistic pace, too fast, and German intelligence might become suspicious, too slow, and the real crossing might be detected and defended. The Ghost Army had to maintain their illusion for exactly the right amount of time. The success of these operations was perhaps best measured by what didn't happen. German reinforcements that might have opposed the real crossing were instead sent to defend against phantom threats. Artillery that could have devastated the actual bridgehead was instead aimed at empty fields where rubber tanks sat in carefully arranged formations. As Allied forces poured across the Rhine and began the final advance into Germany, the men of the Ghost Army could reflect on an extraordinary year of service. They had participated in operations from Normandy to the Rhine, helping to make possible every major Allied success in Western Europe. Their war was nearly over, but their legacy was just beginning. The techniques they had developed, the technologies they had perfected, and the concepts they had proven would influence military thinking for decades to come. They had demonstrated that in modern warfare, the battle for perception could be as important as any battle fought with conventional weapons. Chapter 5. The Final Act. Rhine Crossing to Victory. March to September 1945. Spring 1945 brought the war in Europe to its dramatic climax, and with it came the Ghost Army's most ambitious and successful deception. As Allied forces prepared for the final assault into the heart of Nazi Germany, crossing the Rhine River represented both a practical military necessity and a profound psychological milestone. the Rhine had been Germany's last hope for a natural defensive barrier. Beyond it lay the industrial heartland of the Reich, the factories and cities that had sustained the Nazi war machine for 6 long years. German commanders knew that once the Allies established bridgeheads across the river, the end would come quickly. Operation Wiesen, the Ghost Army's March 1945 deception operation, would prove to be their masterpiece. A culmination of nearly 2 years of training and operational experience compressed into a single, perfectly executed illusion. Ninth Army was daunting. The Rhine at this point was wide, fast-flowing, and heavily defended. German forces had spent months preparing defensive positions on the eastern bank, positioning artillery to cover likely crossing sites, and preparing counterattacks to eliminate any Allied bridgeheads before they could be reinforced. General William Simpson's Ninth Army needed every advantage they could get for their assault crossing. The solution was to use the Ghost Army to create a complete false impression of where and when the crossing would occur, drawing German attention and reserves away from the actual assault site. The Ghost Army positioned itself 10 miles south of the intended landing spot to redirect German attention. This deception would need to be absolutely convincing, because German observers would be watching every Allied movement with desperate intensity. The survival of the Reich might depend on their ability to identify and defeat Allied river crossing attempts. The scope of Operation Wiesen was breathtaking. The Ghost Army inflated both 600 dummies and their own size by impersonating 2 divisions and 40,000 troops. For a unit that actually numbered only about 1,100 men, this represented an incredible multiplication of apparent strength. They were pretending to be nearly 40 times larger than they actually were. Creating the illusion of such a massive force required every technique the Ghost Army had perfected over months of operations. The men inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles, creating what appeared from German observation posts to be the largest military buildup they had yet seen along the Rhine. The inflatable tanks and vehicles were positioned with careful attention to how German observers would view them. The dummy equipment was arranged in patterns that suggested multiple divisional assembly areas, complete supply bases, and forward staging areas for river crossing equipment. Every detail had to be perfect, because German photo interpreters and ground observers were experienced professionals who knew exactly what to look for. To give the impression that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were amassing, radio chatter spread false reports about their intended movements, and sonic trucks blasted a soundtrack of pontoon bridge construction, artillery fire, and even officers swearing. The radio deception for Operation Wiesen was particularly sophisticated, requiring the creation of complete communications networks for 2 phantom divisions. The radio specialists had to know not just the communication patterns of American divisions, but the specific procedures and protocols that would be used for a river crossing operation. They transmitted detailed logistics discussions, engineering reports on water conditions, and tactical communications that painted a complete picture of preparation for a major assault. The sonic deception specialists created what may have been their most ambitious audio landscape of the war. They blared simulated sounds of soldiers building pontoon boats, enabling the 9th to enter Germany with little resistance. But this wasn't just the sound of construction. It was the sound of a specific type of military engineering operation. The sonic specialists had spent weeks studying actual pontoon bridge construction, recording the sounds of engineers assembling bridges, testing equipment, and preparing for river crossings. They then modified and enhanced these recordings to create the audio signature of massive construction projects involving thousands of men. The sounds had to be projected across the Rhine to German listening posts, which required careful positioning of the sound trucks and precise timing of the audio effects. German intelligence personnel, listening to these sounds night after night, would form a clear picture of where the Americans intended to cross. The visual artists added their own contributions to the deception. They created fake supply dumps that looked convincing from aerial reconnaissance, painted appropriate unit markings on the dummy equipment, and even hung laundry on lines to suggest the presence of large numbers of troops. Bill Blass, now a veteran of nearly a year of deception operations, applied his designer's eye to ensuring that every visual element supported the overall illusion. The positioning of equipment, the patterns of wear and use, even the way camouflage nets were draped over vehicles, all had to look authentic to observers who had spent years studying Allied military practices. The timing of Operation Viasyn was as crucial as its execution. The deception had to build gradually, like a real military operation would, allowing German intelligence time to notice the build-up and react to it. But it also had to be maintained until the real crossing was well underway, preventing German forces from realizing they had been fooled until it was too late to redeploy. The success of the operation exceeded everyone's expectations. German forces committed significant reserves to defending the false crossing site, positioning artillery and infantry to repel what they believed would be a major assault. Meanwhile, the actual crossing point 10 miles away remained lightly defended. Ninth Army encountered minimal resistance. German forces that should have been defending the crossing were instead waiting for an attack that would never come. The bridgehead was established quickly and expanded rapidly, allowing massive Allied forces to pour into Germany with relatively light casualties. The Ghost Army's contribution to this success was immeasurable. By drawing German attention away from the real crossing, they had made possible one of the most successful river crossing operations of the war. Thousands of Allied soldiers lived because German artillery was aimed at empty fields instead of actual assault boats. Operation Viasyn demonstrated that the techniques the Ghost Army had developed were capable of fooling even desperate enemies fighting for their homeland's survival. As Allied forces poured across the Rhine and began the final advance into Germany, the war entered its last phase. German resistance crumbled rapidly as Allied armies advanced toward Berlin from both east and west. The need for large-scale deception operations diminished as German forces lost the capability to mount effective counterattacks. In July and was deactivated on September 15th after the Japanese surrender. For the men of the Ghost Army, victory brought mixed emotions. They were proud of their unique contributions to Allied success, but they also understood that their extraordinary wartime mission was ending. At the end of the war, according to the Suiter's book, the Ghost Army's deception equipment was recycled for use in the Army's aggressor force training program, which created a hypothetical enemy for troops practicing fighting. The rubber tanks and sound equipment that had fooled the German army would now be used to train a new generation of American soldiers. Following the war, the unit's soldiers were sworn to secrecy, records were classified, and equipment packed away. Except for a newspaper article right after the war, no one spoke publicly about the deceivers until a 1985 Smithsonian article. The extraordinary story of the Ghost Army remained largely unknown for more than 40 years. The artists returned to civilian life, many completing the art education that had been interrupted by the war. After the war, many of the art students went back and finished their degrees and became a network for each other as they began their careers. The shared experience of wartime service created bonds that lasted for decades. Many of these soldier artists went on to have a major impact on art in the post-war US. Bill Blass, Ellsworth Kelly, wildlife artist Arthur Singer, and Art Kane were among the many artists who served in the 603rd. Their wartime experience with color, form, and visual perception influenced their post-war careers in ways both obvious and subtle. Ellsworth Kelly, who had entered the war as an art student, emerged as one of America's most important abstract painters. His wartime experience with camouflage and visual deception informed his later explorations of how the eye perceives color and form. The lessons he learned about fooling the observer's perception became central to his artistic philosophy. Bill Blass built his fashion empire on an eye for detail and a sense of style that had been honed during his wartime service. My father and Arthur Shilstone had a design studio together in New York in the 50s. Bill Blass, Jack Maisie, my father, and others all kept in touch for a while. The network of relationships formed during the war continued to influence American art and design for decades. Art Kane became one of the most innovative photographers of his generation, known particularly for his jazz portraits and creative use of visual effects. The experience of creating convincing illusions during the war shaped his understanding of how photography could manipulate perception and create emotional responses. In total, the 23rd saved the lives of an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American servicemen. Their successful missions included D-Day and Operation Viersen, a March 1945 hoax that convinced the Germans their enemies were planning to cross the Rhine River, far north of where they actually attacked. The statistical impact of their work was staggering, but perhaps more important was what they had proven about the nature of modern warfare. They had demonstrated that information and perception could be as important as firepower and numbers, that creativity and imagination could be decisive weapons in their own right. The Ghost Army had shown that in an age of advanced communications and sophisticated intelligence gathering, the side that could most effectively control and manipulate information would hold significant advantages. Their work pointed toward a future where psychological operations and information warfare would become as important as traditional military operations. Though knowledge of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was then public, it was still officially classified until the mid-1990s. For 50 years, the full story of their contributions remained hidden in classified archives, known only to the men who had served and a few military historians. When the story finally became public, it captured the imagination of military historians, artists, and the general public alike. Here was a perfect example of American ingenuity and creativity applied to the deadly serious business of war. A story that combined artistry with courage, imagination with military effectiveness. The Ghost Army Legacy Project, founded by filmmaker and author Rick Beyer, worked tirelessly to ensure that the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received the recognition it deserved. Seeking to gain official recognition of the Ghost Army, Beyer launched the non-profit Ghost Army Legacy Project, as well as a grassroots campaign for the Ghost Army to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. In 2024, 3 veterans from the Ghost Army, Seymour Nussenbaum, John Chrisman, and Bernard Bluestein, attended the ceremony on Capitol Hill. The Congressional Gold Medal Award was the result of years of work of family members of the Ghost Army men, as well as Rick Beyer. The recognition was long overdue for men who had served their country with such creativity and courage. I was very conscious of the fact that because of secrecy, these guys had not received any recognition and thought that was something due to them, Beyer says. As the last veterans of the Ghost Army enter their final years, their story serves as a reminder of the diverse ways that Americans contributed to victory in World War II. They were not traditional warriors, but they were warriors nonetheless, fighting with tools no army had ever carried before and achieving victories that could not be measured in territory taken or enemies killed. Their legacy lives on in modern military doctrine, where deception and information operations are recognized as crucial elements of warfare. The techniques they pioneered have been refined and updated for the digital age, but the basic principles they established remain valid, that in war, perception can be as important as reality, and that creativity and imagination can be decisive weapons. Chapter 6: Legends in the Making: The Artists Who Changed America, Post-War Legacy. As the transport ships carried the men of the Ghost Army back across the Atlantic in the summer of 1945, few could have imagined the profound impact these soldier artists would have on American culture in the decades to come. They were returning not just as veterans, but as artists whose unique wartime experience would reshape American art, fashion, and design. The war had ended, but their real influence was just beginning. Many of these men were young, still in their early 20s, with entire careers ahead of them. The skills they had developed in deception and visual manipulation, the techniques they had learned for capturing and holding attention, the understanding they had gained of how perception works, all of these would prove invaluable in the competitive worlds of art and commerce. Bill Blass, who had sketched his future fashion empire while lying on a bunk in Luxembourg, would indeed build one of America's most successful fashion houses. Before long, however, Blass was dressing former First Ladies Jackie Kennedy and Nancy Reagan, and won more than 40 awards for fashion achievements, including 7 Coty Awards and the Fashion Institute of Technology's Lifetime Achievement Award, 1999. Blass's success wasn't accidental. It grew directly from skills he had honed during his Ghost Army service. His eye for detail, his understanding of how visual elements work together to create an overall impression, his ability to present illusion as reality, all of these had been tested and refined on the battlefields of Europe. He would never shirk a duty. If it was cleaning trash cans, he was right there with a smile and beautiful teeth, Bill Sales remembered about Blass. This perfectionism and attention to detail would become hallmarks of the Blass fashion empire, where every element of design was carefully considered and executed. From 1975 to 1992, Blass lent his creative vision to the Ford Motor Company, collaborating on a special edition of their Continental Mark series. The exclusive vehicles featured distinctive interior and exterior color combinations, the same aesthetic sense that had helped create convincing military deceptions now shaped luxury automobiles. Blass's timeless style earned him a place in the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame. He was also a philanthropist, donating 10 mil to the New York Public Library in 1994. The small-town Indiana boy who had learned about illusion and presentation in the Ghost Army had become one of America's most influential tastemakers. Ellsworth Kelly's transformation was even more dramatic. The young man who had requested to join the 603rd Engineers Camouflage Battalion emerged from the war to become one of America's most important abstract painters. Many went on to have successful post-war art and design careers. Ellsworth Kelly is the most famous visual artist that came out of the 603rd, and, in many ways, it was his time with the battalion, painting and producing camouflage, that stands in as his basic art training. Kelly's wartime experience with camouflage, deception, and visual perception became fundamental to his artistic development. His later explorations of how the eye perceives color, form, and space were directly informed by his Ghost Army service. The lessons he learned about fooling the observer's perception became central to his artistic philosophy. Looking at Kelly's post-war paintings, his bold geometric shapes, his exploration of how colors interact, his investigation of visual illusion, one can see the influence of his wartime training. The artist who had learned to make rubber tanks look real from a distance applied those same principles to making abstract paintings that seemed to vibrate with optical energy. Art Kane became one of the most innovative photographers of his generation, particularly famous for his jazz portraits and creative use of visual effects. The unit consisted of a carefully selected group of artists, engineers, professional soldiers, and draftees, including famed artists such as fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane. Kane's wartime experience creating convincing illusions shaped his understanding of how photography could manipulate perception and create emotional responses. His famous group portrait of jazz musicians, A Great Day in Harlem, demonstrates the same compositional skills and understanding of visual impact that made Ghost Army deceptions so effective. The network of relationships formed during the war continued to influence American art and design for decades. After the war, many of the art students went back and finished their degrees and became a network for each other as they began their careers. My father and Arthur Shilstone had a design studio together in New York in the 50s. Bill Blass, Jack Maisie, my father, and others all kept in touch for a while. This network effect was particularly important in New York's art world, where personal relationships and mutual support often determined success or failure. The Ghost Army veterans had shared experiences that few civilians could understand, and they naturally gravitated toward each other in the competitive post-war art scene. Arthur Singer, who had sketched birds in the hedgerows of Normandy while participating in military deceptions, became one of America's most celebrated wildlife artists. Fashion designer Bill Blass was a member of the Ghost Army, as was Arthur Singer of the well-known Birds of North America. A guide to field identification illustrations was also with the Ghost Army. Singer's ability to observe and record nature with scientific accuracy while maintaining artistic sensibility had been honed during his wartime service. The same eye that could spot the visual details that made a deception convincing could also capture the subtle characteristics that distinguished one bird species from another. Others became art professors at prominent universities. Several worked in illustration, design, or advertising. The impact of Ghost Army veterans extended far beyond individual artistic careers. They helped shape entire fields of American creative endeavor. In advertising, former Ghost Army members brought a sophisticated understanding of how visual elements could be combined to create persuasive messages. Their wartime experience in capturing and directing attention, in creating memorable visual impressions, proved invaluable in the competitive world of Madison Avenue. The influence extended into industrial design as well, where former Ghost Army members applied their understanding of form, function, and visual appeal to everything from household appliances to corporate logos. The same principles that had made rubber tanks look real from German reconnaissance aircraft could make consumer products look appealing to American shoppers. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Ghost Army was conceptual rather than practical. They had proven that art and warfare could be combined in ways that were both effective and ethical. Unlike propaganda, which sought to manipulate civilian populations, Ghost Army deceptions were directed at military targets for legitimate strategic purposes. Performance and art are not just things we do as recreation. They are a critical part of human endeavor, Rick Beyer observes. The Ghost Army had demonstrated this principle in the most dramatic way possible, using artistic skills to save lives and achieve military objectives that conventional weapons could not accomplish. The story of the Ghost Army also challenged traditional notions about what constituted military service. These men had served their country courageously, often under dangerous conditions, but their weapons had been creativity and imagination rather than rifles and artillery. They had proven that there were many ways to serve, many forms that courage could take. For decades after the war, this story remained largely untold. Following the war, the unit's soldiers were sworn to secrecy, records were classified, and equipment packed away. Except for a newspaper article right after the war, no one spoke publicly about the deceivers until a 1985 Smithsonian article. The secrecy surrounding Ghost Army operations meant that their contributions to American victory remained unrecognized for nearly 40 years. The men who had helped make D-Day possible, who had saved thousands of American lives through their deceptions, received no public recognition for their unique service. This changed gradually as military records were declassified and historians began to piece together the full story of World War II deception operations. Though knowledge of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was then public, it was still officially classified until the mid-1990s. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker and author who decided to share the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops after the declassification in 1996, became the leading advocate for Ghost Army recognition. He is in fact the president of the Ghost Army Legacy Project, the producer and director of the documentary The Ghost Army from 2013, and the co-author of the book, The Ghost Army of World War II, 2015. Byer's work brought the Ghost Army story to public attention for the first time since the war. The PBS documentary, book, and traveling museum exhibit helped educate Americans about this unique chapter in their military history. I was very conscious of the fact that because of secrecy, these guys had not received any recognition and thought that was something due to them, Byer says. It was one of the highest honors Congress can bestow, finally acknowledging what many historians had long recognized. In 2024, 3 veterans from the Ghost Army, Seymour Nussenbaum, John Chrisman, and Bernard Bluestein, attended the ceremony on Capitol Hill. These elderly men, now in their late 90s, represented the last living links to one of World War II's most extraordinary units. The Congressional Gold Medal Award was the result of years of work of family members of the Ghost Army men, as well as Rick Byer. For Bernie Bluestein, the 19-year-old art student who had answered a mysterious recruitment notice more than 80 years earlier, the recognition was deeply meaningful. Now 98 years old, he could finally speak openly about the secret mission that had shaped his youth and influenced the course of World War II. The influence of Ghost Army veterans extended far beyond their individual achievements. They had participated in a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about the relationship between art and society, creativity and public service, imagination and practical problem solving. In the post-war years, as America emerged as a global superpower and cultural leader, the creative industries became increasingly important to the nation's economy and international influence. The veterans of the Ghost Army were uniquely positioned to lead this transformation, having already proven that artistic skills could serve national purposes. The advertising industry of the 1950s and 1960s, which helped create the consumer culture that defined post-war America, was significantly influenced by men who had learned about visual persuasion while deceiving Nazi Germany. The same techniques that had convinced German photo interpreters that rubber tanks were real now convinced American consumers that particular products would improve their lives. Industrial design, which transformed American manufacturing and gave distinctive visual character to everything from automobiles to kitchen appliances, drew heavily on veterans who understood how form and function could be combined to create powerful visual statements. The aesthetic principles that had made fake military installations look convincing now made American products look appealing to consumers around the world. Even the emerging field of television production benefited from Ghost Army expertise. Men who had learned to create convincing illusions under battlefield conditions were well equipped to handle the technical and creative challenges of live television broadcasting. The educational impact was equally significant. Others became art professors at prominent universities, where they taught new generations of artists and designers. These professors brought to their classrooms not just artistic skill, but real-world experience in how art could be applied to solve complex problems. Their students learned that art was not just self-expression or decoration, but a powerful tool that could achieve practical objectives. This philosophy would influence American art education for decades, encouraging artists to see their work as relevant to broader social and cultural goals. The Ghost Army's legacy also influenced military thinking about the role of creativity and innovation in warfare. Since their birth in 1944, they have developed efficient deception techniques and technologies, still used today in the US Army. Modern military doctrine recognizes psychological operations and information warfare as crucial elements of military strategy, building directly on principles established by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. No active Army unit traces formal lineage from the 23rd. Both the Psychological and Information Operations (IO) communities use the Ghost Patch as an informal identity, as these disciplines specialize in influence psychological operations (PO) and deception activities (IO), which the 23rd pioneered. Army Psychological Operations Regiment on 30th of November 2022. Contemporary military deception operations, while vastly more sophisticated in their technology, still rely on the basic principles that Ghost Army artists and engineers discovered through trial and error on European battlefields. The understanding that enemy perception can be as important as enemy capabilities, that small forces can appear large through careful presentation, that creativity can be a force multiplier, these insights remain central to modern military planning. The Ghost Army story also resonated with later generations because it represented a more optimistic view of America's role in the world. Here was military power applied not through destruction, but through creativity, violence prevented rather than inflicted, lives saved rather than taken. In an era when America's military involvement abroad often generated controversy, the Ghost Army provided an example of how American ingenuity could serve humanitarian purposes. The cultural impact extended into popular entertainment as well. The story of artists using creativity to fight fascism appealed to filmmakers, novelists, and television producers looking for fresh takes on World War II narratives. The Ghost Army represented a different kind of heroism, intellectual rather than physical, creative rather than destructive, subtle rather than dramatic. This alternative model of military service proved particularly appealing to creative professionals who might otherwise have little connection to military culture. The Ghost Army veterans provided a bridge between civilian creative communities and military institutions, helping each understand the other's values and contributions. Their international influence was significant as well. The Ghost Army story became part of America's cultural diplomacy, demonstrating to the world that American military power could be creative and innovative rather than merely overwhelming. During the Cold War, when America competed with the Soviet Union for the allegiance of artists and intellectuals worldwide, the Ghost Army provided evidence that American democracy fostered rather than suppressed creative talent. European allies, many of whom had hosted Ghost Army operations, took particular interest in the story. The revelation that young American artists had helped liberate their countries through creativity rather than conventional warfare provided a different perspective on American contributions to European freedom. The educational value of the Ghost Army story proved enormous as well. It became a favorite case study in business schools, where students learned about innovation, teamwork, and creative problem-solving under pressure. The unit's success in accomplishing unprecedented missions with limited resources provided lessons that applied far beyond military contexts. Art schools and design programs incorporated Ghost Army history into their curricula, using it to demonstrate the practical applications of artistic training. Students learned that their creative skills could serve purposes beyond personal expression or commercial success. They could contribute to larger social and historical goals. The story also provided valuable lessons about the relationship between individual creativity and institutional success. The Ghost Army had succeeded not because of any single genius, but because it had effectively harnessed the diverse talents of hundreds of creative individuals toward common objectives. This model of creative collaboration would influence everything from advertising agencies to technology companies. As the 21st century progressed and new forms of information warfare emerged, the Ghost Army's legacy became even more relevant. In an era of social media, digital manipulation, and information warfare, the principles they had established about the power of carefully crafted illusions took on new significance. Cybersecurity experts studied Ghost Army operations to understand how deception could be used both defensively and offensively in digital environments. The same principles that had made rubber tanks look real to German photo interpreters could make fake websites look legitimate to modern internet users. Social media companies grappled with questions about manipulation and authenticity that echoed the Ghost Army's wartime dilemmas. When is deception justified? How can legitimate illusion be distinguished from harmful fraud? What are the ethical boundaries of persuasion and influence? The Ghost Army veterans, in their final years, found themselves consulted not just as historical curiosities, but as pioneers who had grappled with fundamental questions about truth, perception, and the responsible use of creative power. Their wartime experiences provided insights that remained relevant in an age of deep fakes, viral misinformation, and digital deception. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Ghost Army was the simple demonstration that ordinary people, armed with creativity and determination, could achieve extraordinary things. The young art students who had answered those mysterious recruitment notices had proven that talent and imagination, properly applied, could change the course of history. Their story provided inspiration for countless Americans who faced their own challenges and opportunities. If artists could help win a world war, then surely creative thinking could solve other seemingly impossible problems. The Ghost Army became a symbol of American ingenuity and the power of thinking differently about difficult challenges. As the last Ghost Army veterans passed away, their story was preserved in books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and digital archives. But more importantly, it was preserved in the continued work of creative professionals who understood that their skills carried responsibilities beyond personal success or artistic achievement. The young men who had learned to deceive Nazi Germany with rubber tanks and sound effects had taught America that creativity was not just entertainment or decoration, but a powerful force that could serve the highest purposes. Their legacy lived on in every designer who considered the social impact of their work, every artist who used their platform to serve others, every creative professional who understood that imagination could be a tool for positive change. In conclusion, the Ghost Army covered an important role in the Second World War, deceiving the German army and saving thousands of US-American lives. Since their birth in 1944, they have developed efficient deception techniques and technologies still used today in the US Army. But their influence extended far beyond military applications, reshaping American culture and establishing new models for how creative talent could serve broader purposes. Iris Dane. Conclusion. The art of memory. And so we come to the end of our journey with the Ghost Army, these 1,000 artists who waged war with imagination and won victories through illusion. As the last echoes of their story fade into the quiet of this evening, perhaps we can reflect on what their extraordinary service means for us today. Tonight, we've traveled together from the art schools of 1940s America to the battlefields of Europe, following young men who answered a mysterious call to serve their country in ways they could never have imagined. We've seen how paintbrushes became weapons, how creativity became strategy, how the ancient art of deception was transformed into a tool of liberation. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops proved that heroism comes in many forms. They faced danger not with rifles and grenades, but with rubber tanks and radio signals. They saved lives not by taking them, but by misdirecting those who would take them. They served their country not by destroying enemy forces, but by convincing enemy forces to destroy shadows and phantoms. Bill Blass, sketching fashion designs in his foxhole, dreaming of a future where beauty and elegance would replace the ugliness of war. Ellsworth Kelly, learning lessons about color and perception that would inform decades of groundbreaking art. Art Kane, developing an eye for composition and visual impact that would revolutionize photography. Bernie Bluestein, a 19-year-old art student who lived to be nearly 100, carrying the secrets of his extraordinary service for most of a lifetime. These were ordinary young Americans who accomplished something extraordinary. They demonstrated that in a democracy, even war can be waged creatively, that military service can take forms that celebrate, rather than destroy human achievement, that victory can be won through intelligence and imagination, rather than brute force alone. Their legacy extends far beyond their military service. In the decades following the war, these veterans helped reshape American art, design, fashion, and culture. They brought to civilian life lessons learned on the battlefield about the power of perception, the importance of attention to detail, and the possibility of achieving great things through creative collaboration. But perhaps most importantly, they showed us that creativity is not separate from the serious business of life, but essential to it. In our own time, when we face challenges that seem insurmountable, when old solutions no longer work and new approaches are desperately needed, the Ghost Army reminds us that imagination can be our most powerful weapon. Whether we're fighting literal wars or metaphorical ones, against disease, poverty, climate change, or simple human misunderstanding, the principles the Ghost Army established remain valid. Sometimes the most effective strategy is indirect. Sometimes small forces, cleverly applied, can achieve what massive ones cannot. Sometimes the key to victory lies not in overpowering opposition, but in changing how opposition sees the situation entirely. The Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the Ghost Army in 2022 was more than recognition of past service. It was acknowledgement of an ongoing truth about human potential. When ordinary people are given the opportunity to apply their talents to meaningful purposes, when creativity is valued alongside conventional skills, when imagination is recognized as a practical tool rather than mere entertainment, extraordinary things become possible. As you perhaps drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the image of those 1,000 young Americans setting up their rubber tanks in the forests of France, their sound trucks projecting phantom armies across the German countryside, their radio operators creating entire divisions out of thin air. Remember that they fought not with hatred or anger, but with creativity and hope. Remember too that their story is not just history, it's inspiration. In each of us lies the potential for creative problem solving, for seeing situations differently, for finding new solutions to old problems. The Ghost Army proved that when imagination is applied with discipline, dedication, and purpose, it can literally change the world. Their invisible war, fought with illusions and deceptions, achieved victories as real and lasting as any won with conventional weapons. The lives they saved, the suffering they prevented, the hope they helped preserve. These were not illusions, but profound realities, purchased not with blood and steel, but with creativity and courage. Thank you for joining me on this journey through their remarkable story. May you sleep peacefully tonight, comforted by the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are those who fight with light rather than darkness, who build rather than destroy, who create rather than merely consume. The Ghost Army reminds us that we all carry weapons more powerful than any physical force. Our imagination, our creativity, our ability to see beyond the present moment to what might be possible. In honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to using these gifts not just for personal success, but for the greater good of all. Sweet dreams, and remember, in the quiet hours when the world sleeps, the spirits of those brave artists whisper still, reminding us that the most powerful armies are sometimes the ones that exist only in imagination, and the greatest victories are sometimes won without firing a shot. The Ghost Army's war is over, but their legacy of creative courage continues in everyone who chooses to fight life's battles with imagination, intelligence, and hope rather than force alone. May we all be worthy heirs to their extraordinary example.